Let me show you a chapter in the Bible that you've probably read before, perhaps even memorized. This is Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, the first few verses is David focusing on shepherding. Things like, the Lord is my shepherd, and thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me, which is actually two different pieces of equipment. One was more of a defense against predators, and another one was for leading and correcting. But a shift takes place in verse number 5. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. This is not a shepherding reference. What does it mean? To understand better, we have to go back to Middle Eastern Bedouin culture. As it turns out, this is much more relational in nature than what you might think. This culture has been around for thousands of years. Some of the Old Testament characters, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would have been Bedouin people, perhaps even Bedouin hosts. We tend to think of them as nomadic and self-reliant or tribal, and those things are true, but there's another element there. Think gracious, respectful, generous, courteous, but most of all, this one word, hospitable. It's a very different culture than the one we live in our 21st century Western world. When we come home, when we travel, we drive up the street, we hit that button in our vehicle, the garage door opens from inside of our car, we drive into our little home for our car, and then we close the door without seeing or interacting with anyone. Now, when David wrote this, David was a shepherd. So was Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They would travel from place to place as sort of a nomadic Bedouin shepherd. But David was not a Bedouin. He was a shepherd, but he was not a nomadic traveler. Abraham would have been both. David was a shepherd, but he was more part of village life. Do you remember the days when you would take a long flight, and after a meal, the flight attendant would come around with perhaps a warm towel to wipe your hands? It was sort of a small, refreshing touch of sorts. It's a very similar concept in verse number 5 when David says that thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. A few dabs of olive oil would be refreshing after traveling and being in the hot outdoor Middle East. My cup runneth over, which is overflowing. The Bedouin host would provide a refreshing beverages. In many cases, it would come in the form of tea. I want you to think of them as living in these Bedouin black tents and in a culture where hospitality ruled. It's not just a nice idea. It's not just good intentions or well-meaning thoughts. It's action put into place. There were realities that went with it. It provided food and shade and acceptance, rest, protection, and more. If you had been an invited guest into somebody's tent, the host would essentially protect you. It was a safe place to be. It would be honoring and respectful to be a guest, to be invited into the host's protection and domain. Food would usually be provided, loaves of bread or cakes. So when we look at verse 5 of Psalm 23, David is the guest. God is the host. This is something you would remember. Now, even though we don't have the same context in the world we live in, there is something special about inviting somebody you know into your home, providing a meal at a table, and building a relationship. When there is good food and great company, conversations tend to rise to the surface that have an impact on the one telling the story, as well as on the one listening. Sometimes these things you remember for a very long time. So for David, he is having a meal with God, and he is speaking of God's hospitality toward him. David is the one on the receiving end of God's love, of acceptance and hospitality, joy, protection. David sees God as a generous host who has invited him into his tent. Here's another place where this imagery is used. This time it comes from the book of Isaiah, chapter 42, verse number 5. Thus saith the Lord God, He that created the heavens and stretched them out, He that spread forth the earth and that which comes out of it, He that gives breath unto the people upon it, and spirit to them that walk therein. This is God stretching and spreading. And again, in our culture, this is easily missed. But anyone in the ancient world, when they read this, would understand this is a reference to a Bedouin tent. You would stretch and you would spread your tent. These tents were made of goat hair. And so when it would rain, the fibers of the goat hair would expand and essentially make the tent waterproof. And then the opposite would be true as well. When it was dry, the fibers would shrink and there would be these little holes that would appear where you could see through it, like seeing into the night sky. And so the imagery that we have is that we have been invited into God's Bedouin tent. It's His. He constructed it. He invites us in for protection, for sustenance, companionship, relationships, hospitality, rest, and refreshment. It's a very relational image of God being invited into His world. We are invited and we are welcomed. And as a guest, we are to be responsible in the home of another person. Now, let's fast forward for a moment to how Jesus treated moments like this. This is demonstrated in how Jesus interacts with other people. Luke chapter number 19, starting in verse 2. Behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, which was the chief among the publicans. He was rich. He was a wealthy person. And he sought to see Jesus, who he was, and could not for the press. It was crowded because he was of little stature. And he ran before, climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him and said unto him, Zacchaeus, make haste, come down, for today I must abide in your house. And he made haste and came down and received him, Jesus, joyfully. And when they saw it, they all murmured, saying that he was gone. Jesus had left to be a guest with a man that was a sinner. Now, it's almost certain that Jesus is going to share a meal with Zacchaeus. In this culture, it wasn't just about the food. If you had a meal with someone, you were accepting them as a person. It was a certain social acceptance. And Zacchaeus, being a tax collector, was not exactly favored by his culture and his own people. He was looked down upon. Jesus, do you know what you're doing? He's the enemy. We don't like people like him. This was scandalous to the religious elite. And yet Jesus welcomes him around the table. Author Brad Gray said this. He said, Jesus loved broken people extravagantly without ever watering down his values and convictions. He accepted them where they were at and compellingly guided them toward wholeness. Jesus would spend time with them, have meals with prostitutes and sinners and tax collectors. And they all knew where Jesus stood. But the manner and how Jesus interacted with them, they wanted to be in his presence. This is hard. This is difficult to do. It's beautiful, but it's challenging. What kind of environment are we creating to be hospitable to others who are both like us and also nothing like us? To those who perhaps are far from God, where or how can we show the love of God? That is exactly what is taking place here. God, who demonstrated extraordinary hospitality, and Jesus, who welcomed people around the table, but never watered down his values. That's the kind of God we serve.